Communicating in high lines of screens, adaptations to flux over lines, 0 lines of 24 lines center locations, to lines maps, and set lines of sequence is back in 7 zeros and transitions. Now we have to start understanding how this all works and locking screen centers. The process of the communication system is to understand how to allocate timelines, frame interference, how calculate and modify how to communicate to a system 0 through 0. The process of communications is configures the system already existing in the position of its present day. Calculates lines, comes in all standards and transitions. Directing ground send calculates and sending mega. Sets communication lines of grounds in sequence into 13 scale. Question over lines, indirect lines in position 3/4. Set 7 sequence in position of 0, 24 line centers into 0 gravity. Okay. Tethers, attachment screens, adaptation of the settings over cross lines, rulers of indication system of the travel. Indirect lines and line centers operate the signals in location system and calculations. Hieroglyphics. Now the panel operation screen, we have to allocate timeline centers. We get L line rotations, travels point communication lines of graphs, L lines of sequence, setting lines of zeros, cross lines of 4s, 2 over line set positions, calculate modify line adaptation lines of set lines, L line rotation line calculation screens, set course centers and jumps card, directing lines of systematic lines of 1 setting, inline course centers back in 0, process line connection setting, and travel communications. All through direction. Okay? Okay. Graph communication lines, mapping sequence, mapping calculations through pi. Okay, very powerful stuff. Planetary alignments, 0 correlations to setting line course centers and 4 setting and set positions. Oxygen frames, molecular line, direct signals, 4 lines of frames, and communication lines of screens. Sets calculation ground centers, high sequence, and communications of graph lines, and length calculation settings position. Process indication lines, high signals, into open window frames of door recognition time frame. Okay, door recognitions. Process of 1, process of 2, process of 6, and process of 8. The set lines of travel. Directing ground centers set position level securities of 1, security 2's line settings, transitions over resistors, light switches, and line camera settings and travel communications. Directing ground centers, process lines of blue lines of signals, location offline centers, and rotation of system and travel, and that communications. Setting communication lines of orange, sets lines of Fibonacci line screens, adapting line position all levels, process indication setting of flux over setting. Sets calculation lines and position lines of yellow, comes in solar generation line screens. Directing ground centers of service, this communicates with systems all through transitions, and direct lines and mapping lines in set calculation. Okay, outside signal. Outside, see, they're outside the window. Okay, they're all outside the TV. All right, that's what you guys are coming into, outside TVs now. So everything that you're monitoring, everything you're watching on TV is all timelines all at once, existing information lines, everything's expanding all at once. That's it, that's that position locations and settings. Process lines indicate lines of 0, lines equal lines of question, lines of flux, overlying position lines of 24, back in 0, position location system interaction. But you see, come out of the TV. Out of the TVs, guys. All TVs, outside, right? Okay, so we add equation lines, screens, set positions of 3 traffic line centers, and rotations of perceived caution. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, process line calculation settings into course centers and security line communications. So now we're here, setting process outlines. Now, Pluto is outline signal, which is outer space lines of void and travel communications and directions, right? Sets lines of grounds, offline signals, offline track communication setting, hypersimplification system. So the more you go hard to the mind line, the more you see things coming out of TV, out of computer, out of frame, out of track, out of vision, out of calculations. More lines of the VR system, rotations of balance, right? So when you see that, then you see the marks in rotation lines of circuits, directing ground centers, high sequence, in location system into your solar system and travel. Solar system. All right, then we get the ground center line communication setting. Change the planets, line and line centers and positions all levels. Crossing angles, process lines of indication setting through all of the Pluto line course centers and calculations. Set position to Pluto and Jupiter in setting. Process indication lines, high signal location grounds, set signal, set grounds, set high line sequence and location setting to its mapping system through traction. Okay. Outline setting, outline sequence, outline communication, outlines pi. Right? And then once you understand that, you see everything coming out of its TV frame and traction. Out of the TV itself, right? Okay, so once you understand how to use the mapping sequence, it coordinates, communicates the setting and configuration system, all time frames all at once in line position part accelerates the setting. Indicates lines, traffic indicates the systems, all their settings, operation sequence. Okay, 1x 2000 here, over cross line conditions here, bounce line, inside line, outline rotation, inside position of travel, X line flight, process lines, X line 2 and travel communications. Directing ground centers and surface and location system and all three settings. Okay, travel calculate lines, side direct signals and line communication system, all through track location of settings. Process indication setting and simulation lines and ground centers that surface sets of position. Sets calculation lines into your sun of communication. There's your sun. So everything I say is line setting and location setting in real-time measure and scale. Now the process that you get positions of is solar text, solar content. So when you're watching things in timeline center, you're seeing it in real time. You set up some location. Let's say you want to see a 1970 movie. Well, you're watching a 1970 movie in real time now. But nothing exists in set positions. There's no time frame in anything. Understanding zero gravity is understanding no field energy with the position, location, and settings. That process communications and settings. Energy, no energy. Energy, no energy. Energy, no energy. Energy of no energy, of energy. So it's a process how you set position, location, your own line system, geometric on purpose line, design line. So how we modify that is online communication system, all through traction, so it's highways in set position. Okay, all through calculations. Into planetary alignments in set traction. All right, so heading signals, location lines at delta heading, process lines at tango, tango, foxtrot. So when you guys are calculating to modify the window lines, rotation lines, sight lines, height interference, and psychos, location, setting, and travel, directing grounds, you're setting sequence, bounds operation, direction centers, and the communications, just watching TV, right? But the TV line centers, you're in this set position here, watching TV. You're in the same position of sitting. So exactly comes in tractions. Now, everything around you is looking at you in set traction. Okay? Set lines and setting. Let's say it's 1980s, right? 1980s, the 3 lines of flux, the 3 screens, adaptations, attractions, right? Modificate the ground centers and process lines of 3-line signal location system for travel communications. So the TV itself goes back to its system, back to time, back to frame of 1970, 1980, or 1990. That process communicates the setting and opens up all dimensional doors in set sequence. Process lines of 1, 0 lines of 2, 3, 4, back to 0 travel communications. Sets calculation of ground centers, online sequence, online panels, schematics over lines, and a mapping system location of systems, all through traction, all through locations. Okay? So I just be very cautious what you watch on TV and travel. Okay, how powerful it is. Because you synchronize here, and then you travel here, and then you travel here, and then you travel here. Okay, and you keep traveling, and that puts positions of real-time measure and scale. And in that position, all timelines all at once and configures the system and track communications. Okay? All right. Setting signals, lines, of course, centers, line conditions. Let's get into 4 clocking centers and set positions. Okay, 0 position, 0 calculation, 0 settings. Process lines is set position 0, 1. Right? So we got 0, we got 0, we got 0, and we got 1. Okay? Now, you understand 3 lines of 0. Strangulation line condition system off the set position. Right? All through the calculation settings and tractions. Now, once you understand how to use the communication system, molecule design lines into flux over line, process indication lines of 0s over 1, process lines of 0, set position lines of 2, set position lines of 3, back to 0 and travel. Okay, that's just 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? So get in the communication lines. Remember I told you about 3, 6, 9? Well, it's 0, 3, 0, 6, 0, 9. So the process line communication lines over line signals puts all position lines, equal lines, equation lines, 0 point lines 1, point lines 0, 0, 0, 0, 3 line centers of 2 zeros, process lines of 1, 0 lines, binary reline core centers of travel communication settings. Process calculates lines of position, location, setting, piece of pie, right? Pi generates the screens, adaptation lines at high positioned over 0, process lines at 0, process lines indicate lines of 0, cross line signal locations, time lines of 0, sets lines of all communications setting and solar sail travel communications. All right? I change time frame, correlates a setting, a mapping system into your planetary alignments and travel. Okay? Very complicated stuff. All right, guys, 0 lines of 1, process lines 0, 1, set position of 0, 2, and set lines of 0, 3. But you all have to go back to 0 because you're not modifying through 4, 5, 6 yet until you understand 0, 4, 5, 6. 789, not 07, 08, 09, 010, 011, 012, right? Setting position lines, high position location travels, point lines and graphs, set positions back to 0, and Fibonacci line screen adaptation one way, and direct signals into flux over line, flywheel over traction, 8 line setting location of travel. Directing ground centers, timeline sequence, and location system, all through calculation setting. All through traction, right? Mapping sequence, mapping communication, mapping pi. Booyah, your Earth. Okay, so your Earth is now in 7 zeros and lines. 3 lines of flux, 4 lines of scale. Position lines of pi, position lines of pi. In figure 8, rotation lines of cycles. Everything has to go back to 0 because it overrides you already existing in the sim through traction. Bring in schematics over screen adaptations and travel. Time reactor and set line communicates setting of omega 13. Okay, there's omega 13 in set position and center operation. See the omega 13 in line settings? Okay, see the correlation lines of graph, directing lines of grounds, high line sequence. Okay, there's omega 13. Okay. Now, process that indication system is knowing exactly how to go through timeline centers and position location metric meters and scales of no balance, no screen, no adaptation, no flux, no operation line settings and traffic communications. All through traction, all locations. Now, directing lines of line centers in location setting and 4 lines of communication lines of flux that will across the location system all through travel. Okay, directing ground centers, high line sequence, on line centers, inline rotation system, all through tractions, all through calculation, right? Then you bring your planetary lines. Let's bring position locations in no levels. Okay, setting communication high center location Mercury. Here's Mercury in setting. Process in line centers. Remember, all planetary line comes to your set position of 024 now. So wherever you go, everything goes. And your sun and moon is always in teleportation, different times, vessels, and communications. All right, so get position lines in Neptune and position of Mercury. And let's line connection setting in Pluto. 3 centers on travel communication setting and travel communication lines at grounds. High single location setting position, solar panel, solar line connection setting, solar system. Process the indication over crosses, line angles, and traffic communications. Directing ground centers, high line switch, high line sequence, high line panel. Process the indication high center line, positional modeling to line, the vertical location setting, the travel position line, point lines graph. Directing ground centers, communicate lines infinity line 1. Set position lines infinity lines of 0. Process lines of 0 lines of 2. Process lines of 0 lines of 3. Set positions back to 0 in traffic communications. Right? Directing ground centers, high line sequence, high centers, high travel, high communication mapping centers through pi communication. Okay? All right. There's your windmill. All right. All right, setting lines, windmill, oscillation line, wind pass. Process lines indicates a setting of 45 line angles. Process that calculation setting, direct and redirect. Directing ground centers to server location setting and high core centers. To the attachment set location lines of flight navigation lines, FAA, position line, FDA, position location setting and travel. Point lines, communication system, all through traction. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence. Now, as we get position location, your planetary alignment is all signal location. It connects to the Earth line rotation, which is 7 division lines, set lines, 7 locations, 7 in track communication lines, 7 operation lines, 7 locations back in 0, 24 back to 0. So we have to understand how to allocate timelines in course centers, line communication setting. Now we come into the goal line service that process communication setting and travel into position of omega 13. Omega 13 line rotates, sets course centers, over line sequence, balance communication lines at grounds, high line settings at 3 travels, in center in position of 0 gravity. Sets calculation ground centers, calculate and modify, directing on ground line center location line, part acceleration setting. Set course centers into part acceleration. Direct lines, position lines, 1 thermal line, direct signals, radiation lines, grounds, communication setting, high lines of setting, travel. Directing ground center, calculation lines, spectacle screens into graph lines, and set sequence location setting, highway. Process lines, indication system, all through tractions, all through settings, all through maps, and all position location to its position location, travel. Directing ground centers, high line signals into open line windows and frame line current centers and 3 travel communication setting to travel. Directing ground centers, high line sequence, and box line communication. Right, sending travels in Merkabah test tetrahedron. Okay. Course and lines of channels, directing lines of blue, offline center, offline sequence. Set travel communications. Directing ground centers and sequence lines, communication inside, line communication center operation line settings. Process indication lines, high line centers into goal, and set position lines of travel. Directing ground centers, calculate and modify lines in orange, over lines in position orange, 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 and 4 set positions. Travel point lines graph, inside lines, inside location, and set position, location, metric, and scale. Process indication lines of grounds, height line sequence, height position of panel. The indication lines of grounds, we set communication height lines of service. We process indication system and travel communications. All through setting, all through operation. Okay. So it's knowing exactly how to go through line centers, and this is all position locations, how to go through 0, 1, 2, 3, back to 0. Okay? So you have to identify 0 and 1, 0 and 2, and 0, 3 now, because that is the proper sequence when we clock and send it to 0, 24. Setting line position locations. And then once you get into that, then you can go to 0, 1, 1, 2, 0, 1, 1, 3, 0, 1, 1, 0, back to 0. But everything has to go back to 0 because everything is set position location with flux that changes communication setting at all different angles and travel. But it's all communication system off the calculations, all the directions, all the locations. Okay? And you're going to find that you speed up your anomalies, location setting, and travel. Puts all communication system off the configuration settings, all right? Okay, so as we go and clock lines, let's get position location systems. All right, so we're going to start up at 0, 12. Let's start with 0, 12, right? And the line center line setting is 0, 24 in the center operation sequence. Okay, set calculation lines is 0, set position lines of 1. Okay, that's how it comes in one sequence, right? Sets communication lines of 2, waving panels, process lines, and position location third lines of communication lines of pi. Process indication setting, ground centers, and service set position location centers that crosses its enters location system at a 45 angles in communication. Directing ground centers highline sequence, set line course centers and timeline centers in pi generation screen adaptations and settings all through flux. Process indication lines, ground center location system to a mapping sequence through pi. Process indication lines, location grid, sets calculation screen centers. Process lines of 4 centers, process lines of 2 rotation, setting line condition 0 gravity, set position of 1 center, 1 traction, 1 locations. Kaleidoscope, course centers line to the sun, modification lines of 0, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, then you can process lines of 3, set position of 0, 1, 2, 3, and set lines equals lines of 0. Okay? So it gets more complicated, and this is just 0. Okay? 0, 1, 2, 3, back to 0, right? Now I can do that. You have to stay with 0 1s first, and then get 0, 2, and 0, 3 into 12, then back to 0. Then you get in position of 0 to 24, back to 0, and then you get 0 and 48, 72, 144, back to 0. So coordinate to that is a product acceleration lines, 0 calculation setting, 0 ground, 0 service, 0 field energy, and 4 set position lines of travel. Directing ground centers to calculate and modify planetary line course centers. Remember the planet communication setting, 3 lines of flux, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale, 3 communication system, all through window frames and traffic communication setting and attraction. Directing ground centers highline sequence, mapping center, mapping sequence, mapping pi. Okay? Then you bring your planetary alignments, process lines of Pluto, all across lines of 0, set positions of 1, set tractions. Okay? Then we coordinate the line center solar graph line condition setting to infinity line, rotation lines, 1 cross line, 1 direction, 1 location, 1 calculations. Box frame traction, right? Directing lines into Fibonacci line 1 rotations, 3 signals, 3 grounds to set travel communications. Directing ground centers, calculate and modify solar line screen adaptation, high center location setting, operation line set position location greens, correlates and setting, calculate and modify, calculate the screen adaptations of flux. Sets calculation ground centers, calculate and modify, directing lines course centers into goal line sequence and position operation lines of time reactor. Sets lines of waving screen adaptations and attractions. Directing ground centers high line sequence, mapping system, mapping travels, mapping line rotation service, and constellation lines of oscillation line pass. Process indication system, all through traction, all through locations, and simulation ground lines of communication setting and angles. Angles process line, directing line ground centers, high line sequence location system, all through tractions, all through pi. Okay? All right, so we indicate grounds, colored in, time reactor line, reserved locations. Remember guys, this is just coloration lines in position of light metaphors, how you track the position location line settings, process indication lines of 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3, back to 0 in traction. Okay? Okay, they would change the time frame and set travel. Okay? Sets operation lines of sequence. Now we indicate ground centers. Now the more you modify your position location setting, you have to understand snowing graph interference of 0 to 12 to 0 44. And that process lines is set position over line cross lines, directing sig location and division, multiplies line course centers of 2 x lines of 1, process lines of 1, center lines of 0, line position location of 3 zeros, line positions, back in sequence time frame, position lines of calculation setting, back in 0, travel endpoint lines of graph, sets travel endpoint lines of flux, question over mark, directing lines of ground, set position location measure, scales communication system, all through travel. Okay? Light metaphors and position of 0, 1 travel. Okay. All right, so we go with the coloration lines of change direct signals and location setting of flux, and solar screens adaptation system and traction. Directing ground centers, online setting, off sequence location system, and travel communications. All right, this is all 0, set position 1, 2, 3, back to 0, right? Setting positions, all through mapping lines, screen adaptations of 4D communication lines of angles. Process indication centers and rotation system and simulation lines of triangulation setting of flux. See the triangles? Okay, light stage and shadows of green line tip. Process indication system, all through set position. Operation sequence, time measure and scale. Process line indicates setting and 3 lines of signals and location system and travel communications and direction. Okay, online centers and that communications and settings are marked by change in time frame location setting. Okay, indicates grounds, highline centers, and windows frame and travel communications. Okay, all right. Inline centers of triangulation. The 1 center is position lines, astral projections, 4-line signal location settings, and high centers. Process indication system and low frequency line ground communication. Set calculation lines of panels and process of indications. Set course centers, black and white. See the cube? There's the cube. All right, so set course centers, tesseract, and line course centers, indirect signals, line signals. There's the other cube on the other side. Process indicates the system over tractions, all direct lines into triangulation line condition setting, all through flux, all through set traction locations. Directing lines of the pyramid over white over purple. Set calculation setting and position lines of high position locations, and high centers and communication lines of setting, purple over white. Setting course centers, line direct signals, location system, and 2 flux lines of anomaly and probing detection. Process lines, indication system, all through tractions, all through setting, all through operation, and sequence of panel. Okay. Okay, so that's position lines 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, back to 0. Okay, all through clocking, right? When you add color, it gets more complicated because you have to understand how to use your own engineering skill sets and knowing how to use those barcodes. Barcode, timelines, represent time frame, process of indication system all through travel, okay? But it's very powerful when you get a communication system all through setting, okay? Knowing exactly how to use it in all formation system all through set tractions, okay? Through part acceleration or anything through time frame. Okay, now, coming into high centers of travel, we have to understand how to get in communication to its cycle. And that communication lines into its word phrasing, directing lines to set position. Let's get an open line sequence. Process lines in all position location of said. Okay, process lines of said, right? Directions, systematical, atmosphere line, intelligence, information, grounds. Okay? Now, directing line set location lines. S is 2 factors over 0. So that's position location 3 centers. So that's 3 equals lines of 0. Process lines of 1, 2, and 3 centers. Back to 0 in traction. Okay? So now you have to tell them why everything has to go back to 0, right? Because it overrides you already existing informations. So get into the atmosphere lines. Process lines is position of Y. Okay, equals lines of course centers and position lines of setting. Docking line screen adaptation A, AB, ABC, D equals lines of E. Process lines of Y equals lines of triangulation lines of position. Process A case and line course centers and direct lines of DX lines of 1, X lines of 1, process lines of 0, 1, 2, 3 equals lines of 0. Backlinks, frequency, back in question, and set tractions. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence. 3 centers and measure. Scales communicates setting and track communications. Directing ground centers in location setting to a half pipe and 1/6 over line and 1/3 set travel. Setting calculation ground centers, online sequence in location grid and set position. Process indication lines, 0 position 2, 3, 6, 8, 12, 24, 48, 72, 144. Set position lines of setting, line course centers, set calculation lines of alpha, beta, zeta, zeta line, and rotation line condition setting, position, location of system, all through tractions. Set position all centers, 0, 1, 44, 0, 2, 44, 0, 3, 44, 0, 4, 44, 0, 5, 44, and on and on and on in sequence. All through setting, all through operations. All through tractions, all locations. All through set calculation, modification, grounds. Okay? A Ferris wheel. All right, so setting line, position lines of centers, process indication over cross line condition setting, and 3 communication system, all through tractions, all through locations. Understand position lines of setting. Process indication lines, ground centers at server location system and travel. Directing ground centers across line angles. Process lines at 45 line angles. 1, 2, 3. Process lines of 6 line communications. Directing ground centers high line sequence. In that communication with grounds and high centers in location system and travel. Okay, so calculations grounds, and let's get in position locations in set positions. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? All right, so that's position of 0, 1, 2, 3, back to 0. So we start off with 0, but now you have to understand how to modify that in a higher communication setting. So 0 over 1, 0 over 2, 0 back to 0, 0, 1 center, question over 0, question over line 0 over 0, right? So that's communication lines, grounds, high lines, sequence, location, setting, and C lanes of rotation, surface interaction. Okay, high signals, high ground, set line, condition, setting, high position, location, measure. Scales communication lines is 0, process lines is 0, 1, set position of 0, 2, process lines 0, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 set tractions. Okay, so that's 0 to 12, back to 0. Setting sequence, setting panels, set operation lines of platforms and travel communications. Okay? All right. And then we come to string theory. Look at this. There's your Skynet in set position. Whoa! Very powerful stuff. And sequence lines of panel of operation sequence. Okay? Then you add your planets. Planet alignments. Pluto comes in line screen and triangulation lines. High signal locations over cross line settings of 0. Process lines 0. Process lines in set position 1 over lines. 0 track communication lines of back lines, 0 communications. That's one planetary line center. Process indication lines come into high position location Mercury. Over cross lines indicate lines of travel, indicate lines of setting. Process lines is 0. Over cross lines, overlapping sequence lines is 0. Process lines is 0. Process lines of 1. Back in line, center location question line equals lines of 0 and travel. Okay, that's just 0 and set position in one line. Travel in positions. Okay, then we come to another planet alignment. We'll get into pink screens, directing ground center calculation modify in Venus. Venus lines of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 operation, 1 sequence line, communication lines 0, gravity communication line, set position back to 0. Set travel communications. Directing ground centers in high sequence and simulation grounds and communication setting and map and sequence through pi. Okay, very complicated stuff, a lot of fun. All right, setting lines and ground centers of surface. Okay, and then we bring it in through calculation setting and travel. Okay. Okay, so we go through outline centers. Now we go through snowy graph interference, crossing angles. Okay, so this is grid markings and holographic line centers and line lengths and line conditions, system, all through tractions, all through settings. Okay, so let's get into positions into 1 center, travel 3, 6, 8, and 12. Crossing angles, 45 angles, and travel communication setting through a map. Process indication setting, all through structure, all through divisions. Locking sequence in all communication system, all through traction. Inside setting, right? All right, so we go through box frames and window line centers and travel communication system, all through set position. Process indication setting, all through travel. Okay? Okay, so we indicate the grounds, and we go back in 0, process lines of 1, indicate lines, question over screen, set course centers, directing lines of 0, set position of 1, cross lines of 3. Now you can time leap, time jump, time vortex. But you have to understand how to go through 0, back to 0. Set course centers, planetary alignment comes in, set lines of set positions 1/3, 1/6, 1 setting, 1 travel. 1 direct lines of angles and point communication and graphs indicates the system all through calculation. Okay? And then you see the map inside communications, all through triangulation. Okay? Ha ha! Woo! See, all your simulation and your map is already done. All angles are all position location, your coding is already done. Now you just have to identify in all position locations, just observe, right? Know it exactly how to see this all through triangulation to your pyramids. There's your pyramid, okay? There's your panel screens, location of your windows and frames, location of doors. Let's bring that in signal. Okay, setting position locations and settings, process lines of 1, 3 centers, 4 set chart locations. Okay, 3 direct lines, platforms over line, E factors over screen. Okay, set communication system and alt track locations. Okay, grounds, powers, atmosphere. And set lines, course centers, XT1000 above. Okay. All right, so formation lines, ground centers, calculation lines, and mapping sequence through calculation. All right, directing ground centers and hiding sequence location of panel of operation. Okay. Cancel deletes all line centers. Now we correlate the communication lines, configuration, system, location of travel, pixelation grounds, calculate modified travel, communication lines, operation lines, and settings. Okay, so it's going to get more complicated now because you're in 024. But we're having fun, right? So I'm just showing you how you come into truth and false narrative now through 024. Not 12 line signals, 024. Now we go into coloration lines and matrix. Matrix is a line screen adaptation where you come into calculation, modify how you come to the classes, to the oscillation line, wind pass, into the oscillators, directing lines, specific location of your systems, all through summer, spring, winter, and fall. That's a matrix line core centers, line direct signal, process, line communication setting, has a clear line centers, line conditions of all levels, kaleidoscope communication lines and lines, high signal locations and grounds, high signal core centers, line communication lines, into zero gravity, sets travels in point lines of communication setting, 3 gravities and settings, product lines is 0, sets lines is 2, process lines is 0, 2, 3, 0 line position backed in 0. All right, so you always have to have 0 in position of going forward, and you have to have 0 in positions going back. The reason why you have to have that, because at 2 lines of signals, location system, all through your flux, your capacitor, right? Which is your time capacitor, which is your flux capacitor. That's why everything goes back to 0, all through set position, location, and settings. Okay? Travel point lines and set lines of sequence in screen adaptations of travel communications. Directing ground centers, high line sequence, docking centers of 0, docking centers of 0, docking centers of 0. Just 3 zeros interactions, right? Then we go through 3 line course centers in 3 location grids. Process lines indicates the system all through travel. Directing ground centers, we go through 1 center and 1 operation sequence. 0 position lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4. Sets lines, position of 5 over sequence. Standby over 7, line conditions setting, line conditions 8. Setting lines in 9 centers into 10 sequence. Sending travel with point lines of graph into deflux. In rotation surface and travel. Indirect signal lines and grounds. High signal lines, communication system, all through mapping system through pi. Okay? And then you add your planets. So what I'm doing is you're constantly adding planets in sequence that on lines at sys location setting that you know through all attractions. All right, directing ground centers in line position, Fibonacci in 1 rotation and travel communications. Okay, offline centers in signature lines of grounds, echo, sonar, and flux. Okay, rotation lines, ground center in sequence. Set position of graphs, 1, 2, 3, process lines of 4, 5, and 6 line communication. Okay, cross and angles, setting line course centers and dimension scales and communication. All right, indicates lines of grounds. High signals inside rotation line condition setting, highway. Directing ground centers certain location system all through triangulation setting and cross location setting. Indicates grounds into triangulation lines of set position. Process indicates lines of panels of set position. Process in that line communication setting and rotational lines into hallways and travel and track communications. All right, so it's knowing exactly how to see a mapping line and a 45 angle of flux communication. Okay? All right, so basically we're just working with line condition setting. So once you understand how to go through 0 and 12, you can go in position of 0, 1, 2, 3. But you have to stand position lines of cycles now because it has a direct line link that gets in communication system of balance. Now, the balance in that is the players of communication system. So now you understand why 0 goes back to 0 because it's a flux, time capacitor, flux capacitor, right? So every time you're going back there, it processes everything direct and redirect. How you process set positions, all through transitions, all through locations, all through set positions. Okay, so now we're going through line condition setting. Now, how to come into the line screen, how the brain converts a system line condition setting is downshifting lines of line connection. Right over left, 3 centers of operation, 3 indications. All through travel, all through calculation. Okay? So you're reading right over left. Okay? You're reading right over left. Okay? There's the platforms of balance of yin and yang. Okay? All right, so then you get grounds of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of set travel communications. Okay? Setting graph communications, high centers, process lines are equal. Okay, you have an equal sign, right? You have a platform. That's a transaction of transition in set calculations. Okay, and then you go through the platforms in set travel, the 3 set calculation. All right, And when you get in that positions, you can online cross-line into 45 line angles and travel in that indication system all through 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, and 0 set position of 0, 4, back in 0 of operation set sequence, all through set calculation. All right, directing grounds and set lines of sequence and set lines of travel and that communication lines of laser communication system all through satellite. Okay. But you can see the ground centers of service. Look at this system line. You can see Earth within location to its grounds and settings. Okay, the Earth within the ground centers, outside in, inside out location, right? And then we add the tethers, the attachment screens, and location of string theory that sets communication system of the calculation. Directing ground centers highline sequence, process lines of platforms of C, E, X, line condition setting, and D, X lines of 1 and platform communication. Directing ground centers highline sequence, we have the 4 line centers. Look at this in traction. and this in panel. All right. So you have to truly understand how this works, how this calculates and modifies, how you calculate and modify line condition setting and set position of 0 and position of 3 back to 0. You indicate the grounds as set travel in that communication system all through satellites and travel communications, all through traction, right? And all direct signals and location system in set calculation. Very powerful stuff, guys. Okay, and then you have an open panel here, another location grid and set travel. Okay, and then you have another set location and travel, right? Because now you're getting understanding how to go through 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, and 0, 4, and set travel back to 0. Okay, look how powerful that is. So everything comes to you through attractions, indirect lines and link, process lines of indication setting, and 3 centers, location system, and set traction. Okay, very, very powerful stuff. Okay, panel operation. Look at that in travel. Booyah. Okay, so as we indicate the platforms, the 0 correlation setting change time frames. Setting platforms and E factors of our lines, process of indication setting in real time. Sets calculation ground centers lines of sequence, 2 tubing, 3 centers over travel, 3 indicates lines high, position lines 0 over set position lines of travel, and cross line angle communications. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, and location system, all through track location. Okay? See that? See the portal? On the platform? So the black hole, this is a black hole. That's that position of grounds. So, it's true to understand how this all works in set position. Okay? The more you understand this, the more you understand what's going on with your setting through 0s and 1s. Okay? In set position back to 0. Right? Important communications and settings all through traction. Look at this in set position. Okay? So there's so many ways of looking at this. All through platforms of indications. Okay? All right, so that's one way to look at line position of 0, 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, back to 0. Right? Okay, so it gets more complicated, but a lot more fun now, right? Because you're moving faster through timeline setting. Now let's get in indication system of 3 zeros and tractions. So how you turn on a computer and how you turn off a computer. Okay, how you turn on is 0, how you turn off is 1. How you turn line position. So if you're going to go to 0 to 1 and you want to go to 2, that's time jump of 2 set position. Okay, which is your graph communication and settings. Okay, wires of indication lines, alpha line, change graph communication 45 line angles in that communication system and travel. Has a direct line link and rotation service of arrows of indication. Okay, cross indication lines of alpha, set position of delta, calculation 1 theta, box frame, and travel communication. Okay, directing ground centers and service lights of 4 signal location setting, box frame, outline frame, and travel communications. Directing lines of window frames and set lines of 2 centers and rotates of 3 centers of travel. Set calculation ground centers line communication setting of 4 lines of communication lines of travel. So indicates lines of location grid, outside in line rotations, outside track communication setting, and volume. Process indication lines of flux into screen centers and 3 centers. Process and line course centers and travel communications. And direct line and link of communication system highlights of travel. Directing ground centers, 45 line angles, and high signal location system off the traction. Directing ground centers in high sequence in a 45 angle and set travel communication off the setting. Okay? So it's basically understand how to use this in all three platform. Starting with 0 gravity in position location of 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, back to 0. Okay, so the drawings get more complicated, but it gets more of communication lines of balance when you stand the indication system all through tractions. Okay, all through indication. All right, and again, you can bring your planetary lines. All right, so Pluto's here, Pluto crosses over here, and back in center of 0. Okay. Remember, all planets and alignments are constantly always in rotation, right? Never stopping the signal. And let's get into Venus over here. Attractions is center operation, ground centers, line settings. Planets can go through anything, lines of copy and paste and travel communications, right? So let's just start with attract centers, and we go to location setting, solar line conditions into solar streams. Solar lines set location setting and travel. Okay? Calculate and modify outline centers in location system of the calculations. Of the setting, of the operation. Okay? So it gets more complicated when you go higher lines of screens and numbers in sequence in set position. Okay, platform here, 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 3 centers of 4, set lines of 6, ground centers, lines of 8, over 12 is line centers into pyramid activation, rotation, surface of travel. Okay, crosses angles, sets communication system, off the calculation, off the setting, off the operation. Okay? So you're constantly working with all the settings in your Skynets. You know exactly how to get in position laser track centers locations. Directing grounds, highline sequence in open panels of communication setting and triangulation flux over setting. Okay. Window frames of travel and direct lines of link over communication lines of setting. Okay. So now you understand how to get communication setting where things get a lot more trickier in set position and location of the system. Okay. This is going to help you and guide you more because you understand what's going on when you go into schematics and understand how to go through 0, position 24, back to 0, right? But we only went to 0 to 12. Now 0 to 24 is complicated because it goes faster in set lines of sequence and set positions. All right, so let's get into the binary. Okay, 7 lines of zeros, process of 0, position line settings equals 4 zeros in traction. Okay, and then we question over here, and then we question over here. It's set travel communications, all right? Okay, so that's position up, that's position down, right? So what you have to start identifying is how to understand how to change that and set position lines of calculation setting. So this is position up, this is position down, right? So how you communicate to a system through a set position of a book is line condition setting of right over left. Right, okay, into left. In sequence, everything goes back to 0, okay? And then when you're in direct, you're in redirect, okay? Then you come into the platform, okay? Then you come into the panels of operation of its doors and direction. Setting position of 3 centers and 4 communication system of travel. The doors, all right? And once you get into the doors, you come into the ceilings and set position, its operation. And then you codify it through your pyramids, different levels in travel, astral lines, astral connections, astral projections. All through setting operation in screen adaptations, in platforms and setting lines of travel. Okay, and then you can position line high centers, location system, all through set position. Okay, now, once you get that position lines of 3 centers, we cross the angles in 3 centers of travel so it doesn't override the sequence location system of the calculation setting. Okay, and we do the same thing on 3 line centers, crossing angles, crossing reference, crossing position location to a system. All 3 pyramids of activation lines. Now we cross the line centers in location of grids. Okay, now we indicate the ground centers as surface location system on a 45 angle and travel communication. Okay, all right. So now you understand why it's so important okay, is that when you're reading a book, you're reading the back, which is the front, and the front is the back. It's that position of angles and force settings, okay, and then you get into the grounds, and then you get in position of the walls and sequence lines of its setting location to its attractions, which is its doors. And then you come into the ceiling line rotation setting at grounds that communicates to its system. And then you come back and set position lines 0 of operation sequence, location of panel, and set attractions. Okay, it's very complicated stuff. All right, so in that position, so you go from line centers right, and then you go cross over to a left, right? So it's a back forth line communication lines of L. And then in that position comes cross lines L over shape, which is left over right. Right over left, left over right, right? And then your line cross lines in position of location left, left in process in position of right. So that's what you're doing here, and you're going here in set position, right? So that's basically what it is in ground lines of surface and travel communications. Okay, knowing exactly how to go right over left, left over right. Okay, and then you can cross the angles. All right, it gets more complicated. So you can add the bars. Bar represents time, bar represents settings, bar represents frequencies, bar represents timeline communication. Off the window frame, right? There's a window frame now. So that cancels everything out. And now we have a electrical fence that sets position, location, system all through tractions. Outside of everything, inside of everything. And then we get into high volume. Process line, 3 signals, 4 grounds to set travel communications. Directing ground centers and be the position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 panels of communication and settings. Process indicates the system all through tractions. Now we have a direct line centers in rotation, surface, and travel. Okay? Okay, so we change the angle of the points, pyramid over here, change the angle, and set position line settings. Change the platforms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Set position locations, back to 0, back to tractions, back to location. Okay? And it sets lines and communications setting, and position location as format and travel communications. In directions is signals, and ground centers is surface and location setting. Okay? So now you see your pyramid here. See how big it was? Now you see it's small. So when everything goes back to 0, it's like a flux line. It goes this way, it goes this way, it goes this way, it goes this way. It goes this way, it goes this way, it goes this way, it goes this way. Right? And then it's like it spreads out, right? So I'm just showing you exactly how you see the pyramid now, which is right here. In set position to its grounds. And then you change it again. Okay, and panels of operation and screen adaptations of flux. Static communication system all through travel. Okay, so you're constantly changing the floor mats and set position lines of calculation. Right? And then everything goes back to 0. It's set position. All through laser, all through setting, all through operation circuit and locations. Check this out. Look at this. This is wild. It's set position. Okay, and different angles in travel. All right, let's go to those line condition settings. Okay, now I can change the window frames again. That puts an outline signal locations. Right, so that's outside and that's inside now. All through panels, also screen, all through adaptation. Process indicates in grounds, high signals, platforms over line, astral projections, astral connections, astral travels, right? Sets position location system. Now, we're going to timeline centers into laser travel, into SkyNet, sky grids, sky communication. Okay, sets lines and signals and location setting and time frame and location setting and communications. Okay, so it's amazing what you're doing. I have 0 positions and 12 set tractions back to 0. It just gets more complicated, but it gets a lot more fun than you really understand how to modify your systems and settings. Balancing your equilibrium is knowing how to balance out your atmospheres, your hemispheres, your stratospheres, your bio, and your branium spheres. Okay? Okay, so it's 0 equals lines of 12. Let's start with that, right? But there's always a 24 in setting. And the process lines of 0, sets communication lines of 0, and set tractions, right? So you have to have 3 zeros in set position to go back to 0 in traction. right? Because that processes communication lines to 0, process lines to 0, process lines to 0, in position of center of operation of 24 line ground centers in sequence of communication system all through set position. Now, once you come into that, you come into this in locations. Look at this inquiry. All the calculation lines to teleportation. Okay, torcal fields, setting communication lines and grounds, height centers, line condition setting, change of teleportation of the vehicle, and rotation system interactions. Seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. Process lines of indication setting, process lines of indication system, and travel communications. So you're constantly changing the shape, you're constantly changing the map, you're constantly changing space, you're constantly changing time. All through setting, all through operation sequence, and set calculations. All through set position, right, through Ryan's belt. So you have to understand why we platitude line screen adaptations into triangulation lines of its pyramids. And 3 signals and set tractions, all right? Ground centers 1, ground centers are 2, 3, 6, 8, and 12. So you have to stop seeing one surface and see all 4 lines as setting all at once. So how you read is basically the back is the front and the front is the back, and now the back is the front and the front is the back now. So that's direct and redirect. The process, the angles, and all that position, how you communicate to this lines of surface, how you connect to this lines of surface, how you connect to this lines of surface, and how you connect to this lines of surface all at once in set position. All right, that indicates the platforms, okay, inside tractions through its platforms inside location. Inside, guys, inside, right, into the location grid. Okay, into security panel, process the positions, and then you indicate lines as 0, okay, in that settings of security, position, location, and setting. Okay, and then you basically see the cars coming out of its system, out of frame, out of tractions, out of location. Okay, and then you change the angle and set traction. All right, so that's clocking centers of 0 over 1, clocking centers of 0 over 2, clocking centers of 0 over 3, clocking centers of 0 over 4, flux over setting, flux over screen, adaptation. Okay, and then we change the frames and that communication setting and traffic communications all through traction. Okay, so always see 4 lines of flux in everything you do. Don't look at one surface, look at all set position of Fibonacci. Fibonacci going this way, Fibonacci going this way, moves forward and travel in set travel communications and direction, right? Online sequence, all the communication system, off the travel. Now you can add your planets. Solar track centers, directing lines of Pluto, directing lines of Mercury, directing lines in Saturn for communication. Okay, there's your solar system in set position, all through sighting, all through operation. Inside calculation, right? Inside through calculation of travel. Okay, so X-ray Zulu, Fox. 4 panels of sequence, 4 flux lines, square root over lines, set position of docking 1, docking 2, docking 3, docking 4. Everything docked lines, 0 docking 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there's always a 0 there, right? Equals 0, goes back to 0. Okay. So the metric meters is a scale lines and position location with system that resets line course centers lines of travel. Okay, square root. What is square root of 2? Well, square root of 2, okay, is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, square root of 2. So that's 2 equals lines, 4 line sequence equals question. Okay, so that's course centers of 7 line signals, 7 line travels, and 7 location system, 777. Process indication lines, perimeters, 3 centers, lines of settings, platforms over C, platforms over D, and rotation setting of pyramid activation screen. Process indication system, set position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, back to 0 track location. Directing ground centers, inside, outside communication. Right? Outline centers, outline settings in sequence of door frames and travel communications. Door break in the time frame, 3 centers of travel. Sets calculation of ground centers, line communication setting. Process indications and platforms. We set an online sequence and 4 lines of flux and travel communications. That indicates the grounds. We cross the angles in box frame here, and rotations back in 0 in box frame communication. Okay, now we indicate the grounds. We online the signals of 45 angles, 3 centers of travel, and direct signals of grounds. The high signal locates and settings, sets up the platforms, and set travel communications. And set communications. Then we go with the highline signals and location grids of communication setting and travel. Set positions, back in frame, back in tractions, back in 0 gravity. All right. Okay, so we cross the angles, sets communication setting of flux, process line, open window, and set positions. All through setting, all through operation. Okay. Okay, so let's get 4 signals, 3 centers of travel, and we indicate 4 lines of flux and 3 centers of travel, direction. All right. Then we change the time locks, time screen, time calculation setting, and time communication system travel. Now, that's a lot of condition setting in position location systems to your highways and travel communications. That's a lot of highways. Okay, X2000 platforms here, X2000 platform here, X2000 platform here, and set traction, off the direction, right? All right, and then you bring your planets in. Planet over sequence, planet over line, planet over flux, back in 0 calculation system before travels. Okay, indicate centers, location system, all through setting, the box frame, and travel communications. Okay. Center up sequence, ground centers of service, and a 45 line center rotation and travel. Okay. Sets calculation ground centers and location system, and simulation grounds in set position to its mapping system, all through triangulation. Okay. So, is everybody getting a better understanding how this all works in line screen adaptation system when you go higher in line centers? Okay, it gets more complicated, right? When you go into higher communication of 0. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? All through flux and set positions and set calculations. So your schematics get a lot more complicated, a lot more confusing, but are a lot more aligned now in 25 line centers and location sequence lines. So 25 lines, basically everything you get in position of subtraction always goes back to what? Goes back to 0. Adding anything equals lines is 0. 0 goes back to 0. 0 lines, 3 centers of 0, and set position, location, new setting. Time reactive. Okay, your flux capacitor. Position of past, present, and future comes together as center operation lines back to 0 and travel. Okay, everything goes back to 0. So it doesn't get you confused of what you're doing through your own travels, a mechanism of just existing all at once and expanding. But everything has to go back to 0 in travel communications. Okay? Hold on a sec. So if we can indicate settings and grounds in sequence, then we can truly understand how this all works in tractions. Okay, as you go higher in clocking, it gets a lot more easier in set position. Okay, you think it'd be, in the position of confusion. No, because you're grounded now. You're grounded at 12, you're grounded at 12 is in the 24 line settings and set lines of sequence. But 0, 0, 0 always has to go back to 0. Set lines, Orion's belt, flux capacitor. Puts everything in balance of communications, guys. Clocking centers here, clocking centers here, clocking centers here, back in 0 traction. Travel, right? Everything travels in set position. Everything's a constant continuous flow of travel connection system. But everything you do goes back to 0. Okay? Now, when everything is in position of balance, there's no more going back to 0. You're just at 0 gravity and existing all at once, which is just the center operation. Now you just come into all levels just existing and expanding yourself through all levels at all times in that formation, living your intelligence of forever existing. All formations all at once. Hooah. All right. So to understand how this all works is all through travel. Okay. So I just want you guys to understand how to modify this and really understand how to formulate this in set positions. So when you start talking to each other, you're going to pick up line settings. You're in set position 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. Right? Platform here, 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 and here are travel communications. Right? There's the panels. Then you come into the perimeter. The perimeter is the number sequence and settings. All right, and then we go in centers. We line set location of zeros and ones and set position locations of balance and travel communications. Okay, and then we get into the position lines of settings and set travel communication setting to your position location of system through your pyramid. Cross grounds and set position location of system. Okay, and then we override the sequence. Time measures the scales and platforms of communication setting. That gets all communication system, your Merkaba, tesseract, and tetrahedron. All through setting, all through operation, set travel, and calculation. Your pyramid. Okay? And you can see it in all different angles. See? All different angles. All through platforms all at once. Okay? All different angles. All at once in set positions. Okay, so once you get that grounded, then you come into your positions of your centers. You come in your powers. You come in your atmospheres. You come in your highways. And then you come into your clouds of communication. Okay? So you platform here in a 45 angle in set position. And then you cross angles in set position, the 3 centers of travel. All right? And here comes another set position, another pyramid. All right? So you're working at all different lines, all signatures and locations setting and travel. But understand your platforms is extremely important in set position location system of the calculations. Okay? And once you get into that, then you come into the doors. Then you come into your positions, how to use 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, this is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and set position locations back to 0, 24. Okay? And when you coordinate that line centers, change formation systems off the travels and direction. Direction of time frame, process communicates the system all through setting of flux, all through setting, all through operation. Okay? Sets communication centers in rotation service and travel communication. Okay? Direction of time frames and location system. Your keys to your universe. Now, when you understand how to open up the doors, it gets much easier in travel. As you go into higher lines into 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, and set position. Okay? But you have to center line the center of 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4. Okay, once you get into solar generation lines, it comes in time sequence times calculation setting, process, calculate, and modify. Then you come into your dimensional doors. Then you come into your keys area universe and set position. Now, when you open up those doors, it comes into platforms that track communication. Once you get in that position location, it opens up the position location of systems all through travel. Okay? There you go. It's set travel. Okay? Powerful stuff, isn't it? All right, so that's it. See you guys in 5.